The tragic reality of human trafficking and the result of what officials say.
A stranger video recording children at International Plaza.
A tractor trailer was packed with helpless migrants.
One of the largest human trafficking epidemics in the country.
Five states have the highest concentration, and Florida is one of those states.
Human trafficking, to put it in simple terms, is when somebody takes a human being and decides that that human being can be and should be controlled, exploited, sold for money, sold for goods, sold for services, exchanged for something for profit. It's very dehumanizing. It's one of the greatest tragedies of our time.
Human trafficking is modern-day slavery. It's not just a urban issue, it's everywhere. It's way too prevalent, and it's under the surface, and it's something that people must know about.
Human trafficking is an epidemic. 20 to 40 million people are affected by this crime around the world. But this issue is not just a global crisis. This is happening here on U.S. soil. It is a crime that is difficult to trace, and the numbers we have are just the tip of the iceberg. But here are some facts to consider. Since 2007, there have been over 62,000 victims that have been affected by human trafficking in the United States alone. The top 3 states affected are California, Texas, and Florida. Florida is number 3, and our population is only growing. But what is human trafficking? What does it look like? One common type is labor trafficking. Labor trafficking is when individuals are forced to perform labor or services against their will.
They put people into jobs very low paying and make deals with the employers to get the labor at a very cheap rate.
The Polaris report names Tampa as a major hub for a human trafficking pipeline that starts in Asia.
It's not the job they were promised. They're not paid a base wage. They don't know the language.
We do have a considerable problem here in Florida because of the nature of some of our industries. For example, agriculture. We also have the hospitality industry where there are hotels that employ seasonal workers. There are many private residences that employ childcare workers, cooks, nannies.
The most known type of human trafficking is sex trafficking. This is when someone is sold and is forced to perform sexual acts against their will.
Women who tell me they were lured to Miami only to find themselves commercially exploited for sex. The booming tourism and sex entertainment industries in South Florida create what investigators call a perfect storm for human trafficking.
By definition, the federal law states that if you have force, fraud, or coercion, that's the element that's really needed to prove human trafficking has occurred. The exception is when it's minor children. When it's anybody under the age of 18 and they're involved in a sex act, they are not capable of consent. So we do not need that particular provision to prove the allegation.
Many believe human trafficking is something that is only happening outside of our communities, in the cities, in the dark, where nobody can see. But it is happening here, in plain sight, in our neighborhoods, schools, malls, restaurants, places where you are often at yourself.
This latest crackdown, dubbed Operation No Tricks, No Treats, lasted a week and a half and hauled in a whopping 277 people. The biggest single catch the Polk County Sheriff's Office has ever made. There are doctors, a resident at Lakeland Regional Health, a teacher at Lake Academy in Hillsborough County, and a pharmacist.
This is happening in our community. 300,000 U.S. children are at risk for trafficking per year. And each year, the number of human trafficking cases in our country is increasing. But the numbers are unreliable. Most human trafficking cases are never reported, so it's hard to quantify what we can't see. The victims can be anybody, but who are the traffickers? When we try to find them, they disappear, they scatter, they change. They live among us.
When I do prevention groups with our kids and our girls, a lot of times they'll picture this Hollywood version of a trafficker that's got, a purple velvet jacket on, he's got a top hat with a feather in it, gold chains. The reality is that, the pimp that might be more likely to approach our kids is going to be someone at the mall who's maybe attractive, knows how to come up and approach and have a conversation with a young person and kind of meet them where they are.
The traffickers can take a variety or can be a variety of people. We see typically drug dealers, we see sometimes business owners.
Parents, people in law enforcement, judges, teachers, the babysitter, somebody that got to know this young person and maybe formed a romantic relationship with them.
Part of an ongoing investigation, an Orlando couple has been arrested and charged with sex trafficking a 22-year-old victim.
From Vero Beach to Orlando.
More people caught up in yet another massive human trafficking and massage parlor bust.
People don't realize that most of the individuals who are being trafficked are homegrown American young girls and boys.
There may be a teenage person that's longing for a relationship, and the trafficker sees that it's a vulnerability and they exploit it.
Anybody and everybody can be a victim, but the key component is exploiting a vulnerability. Everybody has a vulnerability.
The reality is that all of us have things that we want, that we need, that we desire, that make us vulnerable. And so it's basically the coming together of someone who has a want or need, and a trafficker, a person that knows exactly how to exploit that person.
Boys, girls, teenagers, adults, men, women, rich, poor. Anybody can be victims. But how does one fall into the life? What sort of trap are traffickers setting up to find their prey?
A lot of times on social media, people may post that they feel like they were going to get trafficked. It's the whole white van, someone waiting in a parking lot, stranger danger, or they've seen the movie Taken and they feel like someone's going to come and take them out of the country they're living in and sell them in some Eastern European country. And that's just really not the case.
My name's Savannah Parview, and I am a survivor leader. And I share my experiences from when I was trafficked to help bring awareness and help other victims. I became a victim because my mom was a drug addict and she was prostituting herself, and she took me with her sometimes. And there was a time when I was 11 that her drug dealer offered her $10 for me instead of for her.
One of my investigations has to do with a teenager that works at a retail store. The female in that case was from a nice neighborhood in West Palm Beach. She was from a seemingly perfect family. She wanted more for her life, so she ends up applying for a position on a website on the internet, expecting one thing, and it turned out to be something completely different.
There are many dark paths that lead not only into sex trafficking, but also into labor trafficking. It varies, but labor trafficking victims are often lured from other countries with false promises of legitimate work in the United States. Upon arrival, employers confiscate all their documents and force them to pay off a never-ending debt.
They believe that this is the land of opportunity. They are lured here by agencies that often mislead them, and it turns out to be totally different from what they initially expected.
What makes these traffickers so dangerous is that they're able to take on different identities that our kids can relate to, whether it be in person or online through websites, apps, different forms of technology.
Authorities said a 16-year-old boy was repeatedly sexually abused by 4 men who kept him prisoner inside of a mobile home in St. Petersburg. Investigators say that the child was lured away from his family on an app called Discord, which allowed the suspects to talk directly to this child.
We had one trafficker, for example. This trafficker met this girl at McDonald's. She was a runaway. He said, "Hey, how you doing?" He provided her information. He bought her lunch. He gave her cash. He said, "Hey, if you need anything from me, you need any place to stay, I'm around here. Just give me a call." And he left.
It's going to be people that have taken the time to invest in the victim and gotten to know them and got to a level of trust where that victim ends up going along with whatever the trafficker may be proposing.
And he saw her again. He stopped by. She was in the same area. He said, "Hey, you remember me?" She said, "Yes." And then from there, he built a relationship with her again. He said, "If you need anything, here goes some more money." And he left again. So when she was down and out, who did she call?
I didn't know what a normal child's life was. Like, I didn't have any friends. I didn't talk to people at school because I was always told not to. Like, I would go to school most of the time. But when I came home from school, then a lot of times they were at the bus stop waiting for me to pick me up. He would take me to his house or his friends' houses, and then also to a hotel in the city that people that were in town stayed at.
I've seen young children that come in with pregnancy. I've seen them come in with every STD you can imagine. I've seen them come in with blunt force trauma, a disjointed jaw due to too much oral sex. I've seen them present psychosis.
I didn't have a choice as to what I did. I didn't know what was going to happen, how long I was going to be with them, or when I was going to get to go home, or if I was going to get to go home. I was just there. It was like I just existed.
Labor trafficking can involve an employer hiring an employee and they are working and not being paid for the hours worked. It can also involve a domestic worker working in a home and perhaps not being free to leave the home.
The people that work in the fields, I'm seeing them come in with severe burns. You know, you and I would use sunblock. We would have built-in brakes. We maybe have big hats that we're allowed to wear, but that's not how it works when you're in the field picking tomatoes for 16 to 20 hours a day. I've seen organophosphate poisoning from pesticides. I've seen patients come in at a young age with an exaggerated kyphosis where they're like almost hunchback because they're bent over so much during the course of a day. I've seen people that are scrubbing floors come in with bursitis or injuries to the knee. I've seen people that are dishwashing in the back of a restaurant with scalding water come in with third-degree burns and obviously chemical reactions to the soaps that they're using.
One of the things that I think about often is because I still went to school while this was happening, I would ask my teachers for detention so that I wouldn't have to go home right after school. And I believe I was in the 8th grade when I was doing this. I would ask them for detention and they would let me stay, but they never asked why I didn't want to go home. So they knew there was a reason I didn't want to go home, but they never asked why. there was always several people coming to the hotel room. And then they always took me to the same hotel. So I always went with the same people a couple times a week. It was obvious that something was happening, and they chose to do nothing.
When I trained back in the day in medical school and in residency, human trafficking wasn't a topic we learned about. And I know that I missed cases. You know, I did my best for the patients, but I didn't get them into resources. And frankly, probably back then there weren't any resources for human trafficking victims anyway.
They never asked if I was the one who did it or not. They never asked about any type of abuse. They just listened to why I was there, which is what the staff members told them. And that was it. Like, they never asked me any questions. That made me feel like there was no hope. Because people would see me and see that things are wrong, but they would never ask any questions or second guess anything.
Thank God now that I've been educated, I can say, no, this is not a child who's a bad kid or a throwaway kid like society likes to say. These are children that have been forced to do something that you and I would never imagine.
Those victims may not come to us and ask us for help. They may not flag us down as we're walking through the grocery store. They're scared. They're living in a state of fear where they've seen their trafficker perhaps follow through on exactly what they said they were gonna do.
There was a time I watched 2 people be murdered who tried to help me. And so they told me that if I ever told anybody that they would bury me next to them. And so it was more like they scared me to keep me doing what they wanted me to do.
People sometimes look at, the 30-year-old woman on the street and see her only as a prostitute. And one thing to keep in mind is that many people enter into human trafficking and never get recovered, never get helped. And so if someone enters into the sex trade at age 11 and we don't know about them and we don't intervene, we can't get them out of the situation, they turn 18, now they're no longer protected by that federal law that says that if you're a minor, you can't consent to this. Now they're an adult. And so this person may turn 20, 30, 40 years old, and to most people, they would be seen as a prostitute. How many of them are we passing through in our day-to-day life that we're passing by, that we're maybe interacting with, and we have no idea?
So a lot of times people ask, why doesn't she just leave? Why doesn't she just run away? And that's a really hard thing to do. For a lot of victims, they don't have anywhere to go back to. A lot of times they are going to go back to abusive families or to a place where they don't feel like they're loved. If they're adults, a lot of times the resources aren't there for housing. Being scared about these people who have been so involved in your life and who have threatened you, have hurt you, and you're just not sure like what measures will they go to get me back. And I think on top of that, you have to Whether you leave the city that you're in, no matter where you have to go, you have to get a new job, you have to go to school. There's just so much. It's just the amount of momentum that you have to be able to create for yourself is just outstanding as far as that life change.
The T visa is something that came about in the year 2000 when Congress recognized that there needs to be a way for these victims to come forward and be protected.
T visas are important because a lot of the victims of sex trafficking and labor trafficking will come from elsewhere and think that, hey, if they are found out to be illegal, that they will be arrested, prosecuted, incarcerated, and then sent back home. When in reality, if they're a victim of human trafficking, we can provide them with a visa working with our federal partner.
We know that sometimes these victims are too scared to call 911, that they've been told by their trafficker they'll be deported or arrested. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline is a great resource for a victim to call in. The call does get directed down to local authorities who know and are equipped on how to handle the case. But from a victim's perspective, it might make them feel a little bit safer to call out and reach out for help.
We have investigators that investigate these specifically, and that's their job, is to work these cases.
If caught, we will prosecute to the fullest extent of the law, and the punishment in Florida is a first-degree felony.
We're working both sides of the spectrum here, law enforcement, and then when we get the victims, we make sure that they get to a place where they get the help they need.
One of the biggest barriers in the state of Florida, and I hear this just about everywhere I go, is definitely housing. Housing resources are so limited. When a victim is recovered or a victim decides that he or she wants to leave, there's often no safe place for them to go. Either the options are really limited or they're just really not appropriate. When youth are ready to get out or they get recovered, we need to have somewhere for them to go.
I'm Charles Bender. I'm the CEO of Place of Hope, and we're a children's organization, a child welfare organization, which to most people what that means is we are a foster care agency. We take care of kids who have had to be removed from their homes for imminent danger, for abuse, neglect, abandonment, and just terrible situations. We launched in 2001, and back then we were serving human trafficking victims and didn't even know it. It just wasn't called that back then. Nobody called it human trafficking. We just knew that these were extreme cases, and these kids needed love, they needed to be surrounded by people who cared, and they needed the structure of a family environment.
Silence is the enemy, and it's important that we break through that silence. And I think groups like Places of Hope are so instrumental because they get the word out that this behavior is not okay, and there's a place for you to go where you can be safe.
These traffickers are banking on the fact that when they go out into the community, people are not going to recognize what's happening right in front of them. And that's what allows them to be so successful and get away with this in plain sight.
I think once you learn about it, you can't be blind anymore. You can pretend that you're ignorant up until the point that somebody says this is happening in your own backyard. And then I hope human compassion takes over and people really want to make a difference. We have an evil out there, but we have an army of really good people too. And if we can all come together, God, we can change the world.
I think that's something that anyone can do is just that one human connection can be the difference for youth being trafficked or not being trafficked.
Even if you feel like this issue does not affect you, or maybe it feels very unrelated to your life, very distant, but just knowing that there are people, 20 to 40 million people in our world, people living in our communities, in our towns, in our state, passing by us every day who are enslaved, should be enough to motivate us to be involved, to do our part, and try to make this world a harder place for trafficking to thrive.
It doesn't take a lot to be somebody who It doesn't take a lot to take a minute and think about the people you come in contact with and just ask them if they're okay. You might be the only person who asks them if they're okay. And I mean, that could make all the difference to a victim who's being trafficked, because you might be the person that they tell that they're not okay.